Thank you. My name is Andrew Lawson from Fiscus Limited. I would be quite interested in the views of the panel on this question about the usefulness of progressive taxation. I think Mick rather made the point that the combination of progressive social transfers with regressive taxation may be a useful model going forward. Francesca was a little bit dubious without being absolutely precise. As far as I can see from your presentation, one argument might relate to informality and using taxation as a way of promoting more productive enterprises by promoting formality. And another one might relate to environmental taxation. But I was just wondering if there's sort of broader perspectives on that.
Yes, there's one in the back.
Thank you for a great panel. My name is Tasha Fairfield. I am a lecturer at LSE, and my research is on the politics of taxation, progressive taxation in particular in Latin America. I just had a quick comment picking up on the things that have been discussed about income tax incidence. And my comment is that I think it's a little bit misleading to look at the average effective average tax rates paid by the top 10%. And the reason I say that is because in Latin America, the income inequality just within that top 10% is extremely, I mean, the income is extremely skewed within that top 10%. So if you look within that top 10%, you do start seeing the progressivity of the income tax, although I completely agree that the rates are still very low, but they're not, I mean, I think that you get a slightly different picture than if you lump the whole 10% together. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay, one more, but there's actually plenty on the table. Why don't we'll probably need to give you 2 or 3 attempts to pick some things, but why don't you kick off with a few reflections based on what you've heard.
All right. Okay. First of all, thank you very much, Philip, Francesca, Meg. Very good comments. I want to pretend to answer all of them and try to build on some of them. There is the specific issue of informality. I think that also was raised by Andrew, and that's a major problem. And it's a major problem for LAC and for other regions in the world. And that's something that in Africa is also quite obvious, and in Asia as well. So that's a common problem. And in LAC, it represents a huge share of GDP. And for whatever or under whatever measurement, whether it's you approach through labor market informality, or you approach from not paying taxations in general, is represent about 30 or 40%, and in certain countries, and you see wide variations in countries that are even higher. So this is a major problem, and the solutions to that problem from the taxation point of view was the creation of those special regimes, simplified regimes that from the purpose of collecting taxes is really not adding much, because the level of collections from the informal sector through this special regime, the Repeco in Mexico, the special regime in Brazil, collect very, very little. So it's a way to postpone the problem rather than tackling it up front. So one of the alternatives that we are proposing here is try to gradually start expanding and bringing a simpler corporate income taxation system, and so expanding the formal and the general regime for the informal sector. Also, a major issue is the the taxes on wages, the salary taxes and the social contributions of the formal sector that push for the labor market informality particularly. And so one of the proposals is there again is that perhaps in order to reduce informality is bringing it into the general system and finance social security through general taxation. And that's a proposal that some of the countries, particularly Mexico, was considering, given the state of the importance of the informal market, particularly. We have even seen certain calculations of how much will be required to reduce significantly social contributions and funding directly through general taxation. So that's a major issue. There is also, and in the study we present, that the value-added tax, particularly for unskilled labor, facilitates the formality. So I think that the combinations of the tax policies will have to look very carefully in terms of expanding the formal system, and this the informal sector is so large that it makes a nightmare for the tax administrations to administer that. And so therefore you need to look for alternatives that simplify, increase the taxable base in order to have easier tax administration. And reflecting on Philip's suggestions, whether if you push for strengthening the tax administrations, given the structure that you have, that you will get very far. And I would say no. Because the problem that you face in tax administrations is the results of the tax structure that you have selected. Is in fact, the simpler the tax structure and the simpler the system that you have, the easier is the tax administration. So you can probably improve at the margin, improving and strengthening the tax administration, but you will not solve the significant problems if you have a very complex tax system with exemptions, with tax treatment to special groups of interest, with exemptions of income, of personal capital income, and so on and so forth. So you have too many systems that make it very complex and difficult to, first of all, collect information and compare information in order to facilitate the tax administration. With regard to the tax incidence on inequality or equality, and here is the whole argument whether you should really worry about the tax instruments and then just focus on collecting the more that you can, and then redistribute that influence through expenditure. But we are, and if we are not coming very strong on that, I think that the idea is that optimally you should have both. Ultimately you should combine the objective of having a system that is that are taxing and the tax system is at least neutral, and it's not the minimum that you pretend for your tax system, and it's not regressive. And then you even improve further through the expenditure. I mean, the case of the OECD countries is a very good case where the before and after in both instruments are significant enhance and significant impact. Not the case in Latin America. Although in the few years, as Nick mentioned, it has improved significantly on the expenditure side particularly. Whether you will have this dichotomy of more progressiveness on one instrument and less progressiveness in the other, I really don't know. I mean, that's the hope is that you can combine both and have greater impact in terms of equality and in terms of productivity. And in addition to that, I mean, and this is also true for other regions in the world, they start thinking about the tax instruments for protecting the environment for something that this come as an afterthought, particularly in several countries. And lastly, the comment on the variations of the countries within the region, that is correct. I mean, this is a general LAC approach, but obviously Haiti is in the region, is totally different than Brazil. And therefore, the instruments they have to apply differ significantly, and you have to tailor to the particular case and to the particular country. Finally, on the comments on the incidence of the income distribution, and particularly on personal income taxations, you are right, but the average effective rate is 4%. I mean, these people are really getting a free ride.
That's a nice thing. And Jesse, do you want to come in on anything else on this question, the progressivity question? I mean, you raised some views, and I know we had some discussions with sort of recently with donor policy officials as well, and it came up as a very live topic there.
Yeah, well, it's come up as really a question for discussion, and I was curious to elaborate or to hear from Mick and his elaboration on what he thinks about it with respect to the work that he's been citing. I suppose that I don't have a clear answer on this, but one central message would be that all these objectives matter when we consider taxes. So in that sense, I would encourage some caution about, for example, paying less attention or less, attention and less analytical focus on the incidence of taxes, because it continues to remain an important contributor and a potential driver of income distribution outcomes. Mm-hmm. And indeed, we see countries where taxes are an important instrument, both in terms of revenue collection and promoting productivity and so on, but also as drivers of fairer income distribution. So ideally, in our approach to discussing alternative tax design structures and in analyzing their effects, we will continue to consider their incidence and potential distribution effects and help sort of hopefully expand the promotion of equality enhancing taxation, if I can put it that way.
Mix, as you were sort of mentioned there, I wonder if there's anything you want to come in on, and particularly if there's any other evidence bases elsewhere internationally from the Centre on Taxation and Development that you'd like to reference in this discussion.
That would be hard. I would like to come in, but I will never give up advocating more progressive taxation. I don't think it's a matter of advocating it, but I think there's a degree of realism. But I think more importantly here, sometimes hammering at progressive taxation openly just alienates the people who are going to suffer, and there are ways around this. And it seems to me there are two things possibly in Latin America, two ways around this that we should be thinking about. And both are dealt with to some extent in the report, but I'd like Vicente's comments. Mm-hmm. The first, as you say, what we broadly call environmental taxation, which tends not to be taken too seriously. My assumption is that most well-designed environmental taxation is probably fairly progressive, but I would actually like to come back to you on that, Vicente. Mm-hmm. The other thing that I think is important here that is in the book and you didn't mention, that's understandable, is subnational taxes and particularly property taxes. Now, crudely speaking, I'm going to generalize grossly, there are two worlds of taxation. And the one is national and international taxes, where you get much the same experts who talk to one another, and they circulate between institutions like the IDB and the IMF and the Inter-American Center of Tax Administrators and the World Bank and many others, and they know about national and international tax. Mm-hmm. And then there are the subnational people who raise taxes, and especially property taxes, which are the main single source of revenue for subnational governments, who are not even national or international experts in the same degree, and they're much more humble people. And they rarely get actually touched very significantly by the IMF or by IDB or us or anyone else. And, you very rightly say, Latin America compared to Africa and to Asia is quite good at raising property taxes and funding subnational governments. But, you know, Africa and Asia are just appalling. So being relatively good compared to them is not good enough. So doing more about property taxes seems to me, and as you do say in the book, you know, that is, apart from anything else, it's a very progressive thing to do. So I would say, yes, more progressive taxes, but if this can be done more through environmental taxes and property taxes, rather than sort of, you know, tackling it straight on as the rich people have got to pay more, I would, I guess, be kind of happy.
I'm going to come to Philip, but on the way past, do you want to say anything on this question of environmental or subnational?
No, you are absolutely right. I mean, those are two sources where you can be progressive, and you have not only the revenue objective per se, but also you can affect allocation of resources and internalize negative externality in the case of particularly environmental related taxes, which are in the book we cover broader than just exclusively on the environment, and these are fairly progressive. And taxation on gasoline is one, you know, obvious case where you have a lot of benefits, and the region is, you know, some countries are doing more or less, but the region is, you know, quite behind of what they should be, particularly those countries that are producing oil. Venezuela, for example, the price of the gasoline is cheaper than the price of water. So that's the extent of the misallocation of resources you can see, and in some other countries as well, Mexico as well. So that's an area where I think there is a lot to do, and there are room for increasing. Now, on subnational taxation and particularly property tax, I agree. The comparator is very very low, and therefore they are coming relatively well as comparators against Africa or Asia. But when you compare to OECD, they are, you know, quite behind. So they are collecting about 1/6 of what OECD countries are collecting. So there are significant room for improving there, and the countries are doing. Some countries are doing a lot, but the problems there is that the incentive for collecting property taxes are not properly aligned because most of the countries, and particularly federal countries, depends a lot of the transfers from central government, and therefore it's much more easier to knock the doors on the capital and ask for additional resources than collecting taxes where you had to pay the price of the collections and then you are not being reelected. So there is a significant problem in terms of the incentives framework, and that's why Brazil, for example, today they are engaging in a major discussions of tax reform, and the implication of that is that they have to talk about the transfer system because that is behind that. But there are other countries such as Colombia, for example, that are improving significantly, doing some associations of municipalities in order to have some economies of scale for collecting better and more property taxes.
Let me pick up one more on the way past, and then I'll come back, and I think these institutional incentive questions keep cropping up. Can we have a microphone there, and I have one online. I'll read out a couple of thoughts.
Yes, I'm Laura Abramowski I'm a senior research economist at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. So I think the book and the presentations and discussions have been very interesting. We have been looking as well at taxation in middle-income countries at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, taking all the expertise in the UK and Europe and trying to see which common lessons can be learned that could apply to developing middle-income countries, acknowledging that there are a lot of institutional differences, constraints, political economy issues. And having said that, we have come to the conclusions that there are some main key principles that can be applied or can guide policy reform in many countries, including middle-income countries. And I think the presentation by Vicente was pointing towards that direction. It doesn't mean that, of course, it's easy to implement all these different reforms the same way in different countries, but I think there are some of these principles that can guide policy reform, and that's quite powerful, I think, in terms of thinking about taxation and spending and fiscal reforms and how redistributed they are, and also thinking about the efficiency of the tax and spending systems in each of the countries. So I think one message I find quite useful is to think about the tax and the spending system as a whole, and I think that's really important. Having said that, analyzing how efficient and the distributional impact of the system as a whole is a very challenging enterprise. So it's easy to say than to compute the incidence of spending and social spending, goods in kind as opposed to cash transfers is a very big challenge. And I think there are some advances in terms of methodology, but it has a lot of methodological issues. It has a lot of, it demands a lot of micro level data. And I think we have to aim for that and we have to work towards that. But I think I agree that thinking of the system as a whole is very important. Thinking of the efficiency impact of the system is very important as well. So I think, for example, personally, and I think that's something we think with some colleagues at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, so thinking about taxation in a globalized world and thinking about how to tax less mobile factors because it's more efficient to tax those. Of course, it has a lot of political economy implications, but in the long run, if you want to tax very mobile capital, probably will go away. And so you have to take that into account. And so, for example, property taxation is a very efficient way in a globalized world to get some revenue, to be efficient, and probably it's redistributed as well. But I'm not sure. You always have to look at each tax individually in terms of how to. Not every single tax has to be redistributive. That's what I think is quite important. So environmental taxes, probably they are redistributed, but their main objective is to compensate very important negative externalities. And so if they also redistribute, that's great. But like I think it's important to separate the two things if possible. Having said that, I do think in Latin America in particular, but probably in other middle income and developing countries as well, the issue about tax morale and low tax morale and the quality of the public goods that are provided is a big issue. It's related to, you all raised this issue, I think, and it's a very, it's quite a challenge because if people don't see they are being delivered with good quality public goods, the incentives to become formal and pay tax and pay your fair share is very low. And that's very related to political economy and very high levels of corruptions and not very good check and balances. And so I'm not sure how we go about that, but I think it's a very important constraint. And in that context, I wanted to ask the panel, and maybe Vicente knows better, how is the public policy debate progressing in this country? So for people to know what the incidence of a tax is, so coming from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, I'm originally from Argentina, and I know that the quality of the public debate and the information citizens are exposed to is really poor. Mm-hmm. And the discussion about what's the impact of this tax reform on the efficiency of the economy or the distribution of income is nil. So for citizens to be willing to participate in these systems and to be able to challenge these reforms or to be willing to pay taxes, I think there is a lot to do with improving data available for researchers, for researchers to do more work on the policy, on the specific policies, and for dissemination of this to the civil society. And I think
thanks very much. I'll take if it's a quick one, I can fit one more. I'll do two quickly on the way past, and then we'll one online, and we'll do some final reflections.
Sure, mine's a quick one. My name's Anna Arender. I work for Oxfam, and I just wanted to follow up on one of your points. So I wanted the panel, if you could, to comment a bit on public attitudes to taxation in Latin America, given continued perceptions of inefficiency and corruption. How have the governments that have increased taxation, particularly income taxation, managed to create a public policy environment where these policies could be pushed through and not rejected by massive protests in the streets, which we have seen in some instances in Brazil most recently, but still the policies have stuck. So how have they achieved that?
I was actually just trying to write my question down. That's all right. My name is Corinne Podger. I'm from the Thomson Reuters Foundation. And just following on from Laura's point, I mean, obviously, tax morality is a big challenge. You've mentioned in your précis of the book here that it's beyond the scope of tax authorities. Organisations like ours are interested in training members of the public and journalists to better report and better understand on these sorts of things. But do you have any brief thoughts on how this might be expressed through policy making, for example, as well?
Thank you. I'll give you a chance at the end. I'll give you the sort of final word on this. I think Philip wants to come in, and some of these points actually speak to questions that you raised as well. Just the one point that, Vicente, you may want to pick up. Alejandro Ramos from Montevideo is asking, he says, it's disappointed that excise taxation hasn't featured at all. I don't know whether it's covered, but you might say one or two words at the end.
What did you say?
He's disappointed that excise taxation does not seem to be given any priority, even when most countries in the region are involved in tobacco control and raising tobacco taxes as a key tool. And beyond that, possibly alcohol taxes. Specific question you may have. Right. Philip, there's lots to pick up here, particularly on your point.
I think I'm going to limit myself to basically just one point, which is that how sanguine you are about both the overall level of revenues that a government is collecting and whether it's regressive or progressive is, of course, to a very large extent a function of how effective and efficient public spending is. And if you are fairly confident that public spending is broadly able to deliver what the money that is being put into it sort of promises to do, then you are able to be much more sanguine about but whether you think regressive taxation is more a stopgap measure or maybe just the way to go because it's just the most efficient way of raising a certain level of revenues. That's all nice and good, and I think in OECD countries we probably assume basically more or less that that's what it is. But if you think that a marginal dollar more spent on social sector X is basically going to have zero or a tiny percentage effect in terms of outcomes in that sector, then obviously you're not going to be willing to countenance higher spending in that higher taxation to finance that kind of higher spending. And I think it would be very one-sided to consider the story of revenue in Latin America over the last 10-15 years without also looking at the story of social spending and how that has become more effective and more efficient at the same time. Because it's probably true that it's fiendishly difficult, and I actually wouldn't want to do that myself, to figure out how effective exactly a CCT program is as opposed to the in-kind programs that CCTs often replace. But I think there's very little doubt that in countries like Mexico and Brazil, stuff like Fomecero or Oportunidades replaced very inefficient in-kind social spending or supplemented or supplanted it. And the fact that these things are seen to be working out much better must have some effect, eventually, maybe indirectly, maybe over time, on people's willingness to fund these sorts of things. That's
I'm
the
going to
optimistic note to
keep a little.
conclude with.
We'll run a couple of minutes. If people do have to leave, don't worry. See about it. But since we've got such a good discussion going, I don't want to let you leave without trying to answer a few of these questions. Is there anything else you want to reflect on the way past? No, we'll give. Mick, I'll give Vicente the final word.
Actually,
so.
I'm happy to hand my time to Vicente because most of the questions are for him.
Okay, and well, there's a viewpoint particularly on this question of sort of public policy debates and public attitudes and the tax morale question. So actually, a nice little clustering actually.
All right. With regard to the tax morale, obviously the decision on how much to have as a revenue is a decision that is related to what type of government and what type of expenditure you want to have, what type of state you want to have. Okay, and that's a collective decisions that society make. What type of state and government would like to have, and that those are two sides of the coin. I mean, and obviously both are closely interrelated because if you want to have a state that provides certain public services and you want to have them provided efficiently, effectively, and with quality, you need resources to finance that, and that's the issue. And that's an issue that's beyond this book. This is not the type of discussion that we will concentrate, and that's beyond. I mean, each country decides what type of level of government and public service we want to provide for its citizens. And I just, as an example, in the last few years, in fact, in the case of the Latin American countries, several countries left-leaning toward parties that came to power managed to raise more revenue from the wealthier people. So that's implicitly and obviously a political decision that is beyond the scope of the book, but that's the empirical evidence shows that. And so I'm not going to argue that revenues is there for a function, the provision of public services, and the decision is from each of the countries. But still, in terms of the literature and public finance literature in general, there is the research and the information that we look for in terms of public expenditure is way behind in terms of the analysis and the advance in the sciences on the revenue side. There is a significant gap, and as if students here, that's an area where there can be major contributions in terms of the expenditure side. When we face the authorities and we establish the dialogue, policymakers want to know the quality of the expenditure. And it's almost impossible to have an answer of what we mean by quality of expenditure. And this is a significant gap in public finance literature. We, at the IDB, we started to work on that side of the coin, and we found that there are not too many written about it, and particularly wide variety of methodology, and not a methodology that allows you to compare across countries or across sectors even. So that's an area that is pending in the research literature. With regard to the tax morale, let me mention that it's true, and it is also related and is a function of the public services that you receive. In the case of the region, half of the population, 1 out of 2, consider that evading is fine. which is completely different in developing countries. And obviously this has to be also with the degree of public services that they are getting. And so they are correlated. But there is also a possibility of contributing to the burden sharing by paying what is you are supposed to be paying. That's another issue.
Time for a final point.
Final point, I want to recall the phrase that Vito Tanzi mentioned almost 20 years ago, 25 years ago, when the level of taxation in Argentina particularly was very low. And he mentioned that the level of taxation in Argentina was equivalent to the level of taxation in Haiti. But the provision of public services and the welfare state was more or less at the level of the Nordic countries. So that's an area where obviously more funding was needed. And over the last 20 years, they came a long way to finance the level of public services that they wanted for the population. I am sure that there's still much more to fulfill. Quality of services probably are not good, but I wanted to end with that thought. I think that the region have came a long way, and there is still a long way to go.
Thank you very, very much, and thank you to the whole panel. That's been a fantastic discussion, and particularly this book as a contribution to bringing some really good empirical material Latin America into a discussion, taking away from just these sort of perennial normative questions about the role of taxation, these distributional issues versus revenue, to actually have some cases and hard data is immensely valuable for us as well as researchers. And we've covered, I think, issues from fiscal contracting, institutional questions, the distributional issues, environmental taxation. It's been extremely rich. And even the dress code for tax specialists of the international variety. I don't know whether next time Mick will tell us what subnational tax to wear. But please join shorts, it depends on the location. Please join me in thanking Vicente, Mick, Francesca, and Philip for a really great discussion.